my name is Ida Kosker-Svendsen. I am a biologist. I'm currently searching for a PhD position. I have an international master degree in biogeography. In my master thesis, I was focusing on biogeography, climate change, and conservation biology.
Is climate change a natural process?
There have always happened species extinction. It's not a new phenomenon. Climate change is not a new phenomenon either. What is so different from this climate change compared with the previous? We have the big five, like big climate change, so that we have in the record of the Earth. But these were much slower, and they had a much lower rate of extinction than the current one.
Is there evidence that we have currently a climate change?
We have evidence from ice cores from the Arctic, where you can see how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere previously, and we can also see it from actually tree rings, and it all shows that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now is just higher.
Consequences of climate change.
There are a lot of consequences, and they are like interrelated, because you have a full ecosystem, and when you change something, there will always be like consequences related to that. For instance, you have increased the partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere, and for that it causes ocean acidification, because the CO2 diffuses passively to the ocean and causes this acidification. And this acidification leads to a lot of consequences. You don't even know yet all the consequences of the consequences, because the entire food webs are changing. This further pressure from regulating the pH can decrease either the growth or the reproduction. So it will definitely affecting a lot of creatures. And also adaptation is needed. We see fish from Asia that already live in a very acidified environment, and we see they have developed in a way where they can live and sustain themselves with a very poorly mineral skeleton, and it's probably this kind of adaptation we are going to see in the future, because a lot of calcifying animals have a problem with the acidification, because their shells is starting to dissolve. So creatures like corals, like pteropods, like squids, for example, for instance the squids, we see in very acidified environment that the collarbone is getting smaller, and the collarbone they are using to keep themselves buoyant. So the buoyancy is going to be very bad, and when you have a very bad buoyancy, well, you are a very easy prey for a predator. Pteropod is actually a small shelled animal, looks kind of like this. And it has very important ecosystem function in many marine environments, because it's on the bottom of the food chain. So when their shells dissolve, we can see from research that they have a higher mortality, they just die, and also they breed less. And when such an important animal disappears from a food web, it's gonna have consequences. The oceanification don't just have consequences for the ocean, also coastal areas, because you can imagine when the shell of the coral starts to dissolve, the coral, they die, we see coral bleaching. We can see that all these changes, they actually follow the red-green hypothesis, that either you adapt to your environmental conditions when they change, or you go extinct. Another thing that can happen is that you migrate. So what we see now, both due to the consequences of the acidification of the ocean, but also due to the heating, is that a lot of species are migrating either to greater depth or to like polar areas. And with that, we see a lot of changes in the food web structure.
Climate migration.
We can say there is a lot of problems with species migrating due to the climate. In general, species, they prefer to follow like climate gradient than to stay and adapt. And what we have is that we have some areas where we have a lot of invasive species because, for example, many animals, they go upslope now. And the problem is if you feed on something more downhill and suddenly you're upslope, then you steal that feeding niches from another species. And that will be like interrelated competition between in the receiving area between already established species and then the invasion of alien species to that area. And it can mean actually extinction if one of the species can't cope with the competition. I went to Malaga for 3 months as a research assistant on the University of Malaga. It was very interesting. And they have problems with the climate change also in the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is like the Spain, of course, and then Portugal. And then we cut off. France is not in there. It's just the Iberian Peninsula. They do this research because of marten. It's a species that is migrating a lot. And they have 2 species in Spain, Martes and Martes foina. And what we see is that one species, even that they eat the same, they breed on the same time, they are very, very similar in their ecology, is that one is more aggressive and it's a little bit bigger than the other species. And it can have some ecological consequences when you exchange one species for another species, but this new species, this alien species that is coming, it have a more aggressive behavior. And what I was trying to do was I was using the GIST program, it's called ARGIS, to predict how bad is it gonna be, like how further is it gonna migrate. And I found out it will it will take over a lot of the habitats in the future.
Can we save species from extinction?
That's what we can do is to do conservation biology. There have been a lot of failure and a lot of successes in the history of conservation biology. For example, establish protected area and protected parks where the animals can live in peace and where you monitor their health. But the problem with climate change is now a lot of the parks we already have, they are kind of established where they are. And actually, what research is showing is that we kind of need to move them to follow the climate gradients. So by protecting the habitats, all the plants, all the animals, all the species, and to a little bit more, so to say, extreme degree, you can do ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is, as my research shows, ex situ conservation might be the only possible type of conservation that can be used to save some species that live on the edge of extinction. What you do is that you create an artificial environment. For example, it can be in zoos, in aquariums, in zoological gardens, and then you put them there, you protect this animal, you feed them, you make sure they breed and don't inbreed. You need to make sure the genetic is fine. And with the development we see now, it might be the only possible conservation for penguins and polar bear, but unfortunately this type of conservation is very expensive. And we already do it, and it have a tendency to focus more on cute species, like the polar bear, for example, because people are gonna pay to go to the zoo to see the polar bear babies and so on. A lot of beetles type is also very important for the ecosystem, but no one is gonna pay to go to a zoo to see. Not many people are willing to pay a lot of money to go to a zoo to see a lot of beetles, for example. So we need to take into account to not just focus on what is cute, but actually focus more on the ecosystem functions. We need a lot of animals because they all are interrelated.
Can genetic engineering preserve species?
It's very expensive and it's very risky.
What can science do?
Definitely, we need more research in the areas of ecophysiology, in the areas of biogeography, in the areas of all these consequences of of the climate change because we actually don't know. Many papers do a very good job trying to predict, but needs more research in different groups of animals. In the future, I would like to continue with research in ecophysiology, all related to the climate change, because in the environment right now we have so many changes.